Remembrance Day triggers different emotions, doesn't it? Canadians are often accused as being a little bit less patriotic than Americans. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but I don't think that's true at all. Can you remember what your heart felt like last summer when Andre DeGrasse was lining up at the starting line? Do you remember what your heart felt like? That's Canadian patriotism. Or how you feel when you see a Canadian flag when you're traveling abroad, or when you hear the Canadian anthem. Our troops fought to keep a wonderful country wonderful, didn't they? What else does Remembrance Day make us think of? That Canada has an amazing reputation around the whole world. And part of the reason we have a good reputation is that our troops who fought in World War I and World War II and into Korea and in Afghanistan, they fought with humility. They fought with tolerance of other nations, that they were peacekeepers. I mean, our troops who fought in our wars are a huge part of why Canadians have the reputation we have today. And so we celebrate that on Remembrance Day. Peacekeeping, definitely. So Canada has its roots in Christianity. And I know now things are different and things are changing, and you know, that all is what it is, but we have our roots in Christianity. We have our roots in following Jesus, who is the peacemaker. So it's almost like Canada practiced what it preached, because the world knew us as peacemakers. We remember that on Remembrance Day. We remember today how very young our troops were. When we watch old videos and old movies, and we see those faces of those soldiers going over the trenches and just head on into enemy forces, how young they were. Not so long ago, I was driving up to Orillia with people from this church, and we were going to a conference. And this was before GPSs were on phones, so I got lost. And I get lost easily. I have no sense of direction. So I'm driving. There's four of us in the car. And we realized we were lost as we were coming into Orillia. We had no idea. And we saw a police car on the side of the road. So we pulled over. They said, "Tim, ask the police, the policeman in the car, directions." And because I have no sense of direction, I'm just used to doing that, so I didn't mind doing that. So I get out of the car, walk over, walk up to the police car. I look in, and behind the driver's wheel of the police car, there is sitting this boy dressed as a police officer. I mean, that's how it looked to me. I mean, he looked like he could have been 16, 17 years old. The police officer, and I said, you know, and he gave me directions, and we went on our way. But as I drove away, I just thought, the people that are protecting us are so young. They're kids. It makes it so much more poignant when we think about sacrifice, when we think about not just what they gave up in war, but what their families gave up. 17 years old, 18 years old. We think a lot of Remembrance Day in a lot of different things. Some of us at Remembrance Day wonder if war can ever be right. There's hawks and doves among us. Some of us just don't think war can ever be right, and others just have a whole different opinion of what war can be. And I just want to share with you a really short story of what I've witnessed that helped me to understand that. I was outside of a nightclub years ago, and there was a guy coming out with his wife, coming out of this nightclub, and he was just abusive to her. He was pushing her, he was hitting her, he was yelling at her. There were a few people around kind of watching. And then the police pulled up. The police officers got out of the car, and they must have spent like 3 or 4 minutes trying to talk to this guy who was being abusive to his wife. And I was just watching, so impressed at what the police were doing to avoid any kind of violence with this man. But eventually, they had to grab him, they had to cuff him, they had to use force eventually, because he just wasn't going to listen. I learned on that day that there comes a time when force is necessary to maintain peace. That's what I learned. Some of us might not agree with that, but we wrestle with that sometimes at Remembrance Day. So many of our veterans we've lost here. And if you're a member of this church, you remember who we've lost. Bill Allen and Chick and Johnny Richards. And we acknowledge the veterans who are still among us. John Diston is well into his 90s, as is Bill Murray. Lauren Perkins, who actually just moved and is now living with his daughter. We remember veterans who are among us. I think Bob's here. Bob Allen is here today, and Arnie McKay. But today we also acknowledge that our veterans are not just older people. See, when I was growing up, stories of war were like a whisper from another place. They weren't personal for me. Anybody born between 1945 and 1965, war, the stories we always heard, but they were just never personal. We never lost family members. We never heard bombs whistling through the air. But then in 2001, Canada became part of an armed conflict. And for the next 13 years, Canada was involved in the war in Afghanistan. And 40,000 Canadians were a part of that armed conflict. And 165 Canadians were killed in Afghanistan. And now it's recent history. We have veterans who are in their 30s now. There are young people from this church who will soon be veterans someday. Kenzie Saville is in her 20s. Matthias Hike are both officers in the Canadian Armed Forces. Graham Trude and our son Taylor, they are both veterans, although Taylor has just turned 30. Remembrance Day asks us to find joy in our lives. Because the people who gave their lives for us would want us to celebrate what we have. And they might even say that if you don't find joy in your life and you don't find ways to be happy, then did what I do for you, was that in vain? Here's an image that might be helpful. Imagine two 7-year-old girls playing. They're running around playing. They're oblivious to everything that's going on around them, as 7-year-old girls will be like when they're playing. One of them goes out onto the street, doesn't see a car coming right at her, because she's just playing. She's not. To your horror, you see that she's going to be hit by this car. And then suddenly the parent appears. And mother dives out onto the street, pushes girl away, and is killed in the accident. Now, if that girl grew up to never find any happiness, if that girl grew up sad over that event, depressed over that event for the rest of her life, the mother would be going, I want you to laugh. I want you to find joy. That's why I gave my life for you. I want you to live life in the fullest you can possibly live it. I don't want you to just survive. I want you to live abundantly. And I think that's what our veterans would say to us on this day. I gave so much so that you could be Canadians, so that you could do what Canadians could do, so that you could find freedom and dance and joy and find laughter. So Remembrance Day reminds us to find joy in our lives. There's a clear connection between what Jesus gave and what veterans gave. Jesus gave his life. He died on a cross to show us what the power of love is. And then he said, as I have loved, so also will you love. The veterans gave their lives to show us what love is. It's like in John, the Apostle John said, there is no greater love than when a friend is willing to give up his life for another friend. And so here's the question that's before us on this Remembrance Day. It's just a really simple question, but it applies to every single person in this room on an equal level, on an equal basis. Here's the question. After everything that they did for us, what's the least we can do in response? It's such a theme of the Bible, all through the Bible. God has loved me. I need to love each other. I've been forgiven. I need to forgive each other. Jesus showed me how to serve. I need to go serve each other. So what's the least we can do in response? What's the least we can do in our community to model what the veterans did? What's the least we can do in our families to model what the veterans did? Or in the workplace, or wherever it is that we are? What's the least we could do to pay tribute to them? But I was thinking about that, and I realized I had the wrong question. I'm asking the wrong question. The question before you is wrong. I got it wrong. Here's the right question. What's the most I can do in response? If you can move yourself away from the least and move yourself more toward the most, you could change the world. Which is kind of what our veterans did for us. What's the most that we can do as we go out into the world after this Remembrance Day, remembering what the veterans did in response to the model that Jesus first set? Last thing. Remembrance Day reminds us of this truth. This was first articulated by Jose Naroski, who is an Argentine author. Have you ever heard this before? There's no unwounded soldiers in war. The first time I read that, I just thought, wow, how is it that for so many decades people came back from wars and nobody thought about this sentence? Like Chick and Bill and Bruce and all of the guys we knew from this church came back, and nobody thought about how they had been wounded in war. You can't go to war and see the things that people see in war without having some kind of effect on veterans. So now we're more aware of it in our society. Last story. I officiated a wedding once. It was right here. I was standing in the exact place, and when I was talking with the groom, he was a fit guy, polite. I just loved this guy, a stand-up guy. He was about 28, 29 years old. And as we were talking, he kept calling me sir. And I said, I don't have that many people to call me sir. And he said, well, it's really not so much about you, it's just old habits die hard. And then he went on to tell me that he was a veteran. He had served in Afghanistan. And he had been involved, he said, in firefights in Afghanistan. And he said, when I got home, I really struggled. I struggled with my family. I struggled with drinking. I struggled with being abusive. I struggled with just trying to find any kind of happiness at all. And then he told me where he lived in Collingwood. He lived on Robinson Street. And as he talked, I realized that he had been my neighbor when we lived on Hume Street. We lived on Hume here. He lived on Robinson here. His backyard backed out onto our backyard. And many a night, we listened to yelling and screaming and drunken talk and doors slamming and police lights flashing. And Kimberly and I and Haven and his son used to go to school with Haven, and he was the bully of the class. She'd come home every day talking about this bully, and she was just always afraid of this kid. And we got to the point where we just asked ourselves, what kind of person lives in a house like that? Like, what kind of family acts like that? So back to the wedding, I'm talking to him, and he said, I got home, and it was just a mess, but I finally got some help. I got some counseling help specifically for my PTSD. And he said, after that, I just got my life together. I found the help that I needed. And my family was better. I stopped drinking, and my son even began to behave better in his school. And the answer to my question was just right there before me. That my question, what kind of a person lives in a house like that? The answer was a veteran lives in a house like that. A veteran who gave a lot to keep us free and who now needs our help. On this Remembrance Day, we're just called to be aware of people who suffer through that condition that they have brought home with them. But not only that, we're called as Christians to be aware of all the people who surround us who are wounded. All the people who need healing in some way. What better way to pay tribute to our veterans? What better way to pay tribute to what Jesus did than to be attentive to all of the wounded around us. Paul just finished with this verse. This is what Perry read. Christ humbled himself even to death on a cross. There is no higher virtue than being willing to give life for another in the name of love. That's what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13. He said, now I'll show you the most excellent way. There is no more excellent way of living than to live this kind of love. But Paul didn't end there. It doesn't end with death on a cross. It doesn't end with death on a cross. Paul finishes with these words, therefore. Yes, Jesus died on a cross, but that's not the end. Therefore, God exalted him in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and he shall be called everlasting. And because Christ lives, so also will we live. It's not over. For the people that we have lost in war, we will sit together again with them in a place of no more pain, no more tears, no more wars, no more battlefields, no more curse of sin. And we confess together today that those who have been lost, we can help find them today. Those who have been broken, we can help heal them today through our love for them. And that's the most we can do.